The moment Elvira Grady opened her mouth to speak in front of the crowded saloon, she knew that half the town of Richest Flats was already prepared to disbelieve every word she said. It was the autumn of 1882, and the territory of New Mexico was a place where a woman's word carried about as much weight as a dry leaf in a desert wind, unless she had a man standing beside her to confirm it. Elvira had no such man. She had not had one for 2 years, not since her husband, Thomas Grady, had ridden out toward the canyon trails and never come back. What she did have was a homestead on the eastern edge of town, a herd of 30 cattle that someone had been slowly stealing from her, and a knowledge of exactly who had been doing the stealing. That knowledge was about to cost her everything she had left, or so she feared. The saloon was called the Dusty Spur, and on this particular Wednesday evening it was serving as the de facto courthouse for Richest Flats, since the actual courthouse in Santa Fe was 2 days hard riding away, and nobody had the patience for it. The oil lamps cast a warm amber glow across the room, and the smell of sawdust and whiskey hung in the air like something permanent. Elvira stood at the front near the bar, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath a sun-faded hat, her dress plain but clean, her hands steady at her sides even though her heart was hammering loud enough that she was almost certain the man sitting nearest to her could hear it. Sheriff Dunmore sat at the center table with his wide-brimmed hat pushed back on his head, a big man with a red face and small eyes that seemed perpetually suspicious. Beside him sat Claude Harker, which was the problem, and the reason for everything. Claude Harker was the wealthiest rancher in Richest Flats, possibly in that entire quarter of New Mexico territory. He owned the biggest spread of land for 50 miles in every direction. He employed half the working men in town, and he had a smile like a man who knew he would never be held accountable for anything he did. He was 43 years old, broad-shouldered, and handsome in the way that money made men handsome. He was also, Elvira knew with complete and total certainty, the man who had been sending his hired hands out in the dead of night to drive cattle off her land. She had seen it herself. 3 weeks ago, she had been unable to sleep, and had gone to check on the horses when she heard the unmistakable low sound of cattle moving on the far edge of her property. She had taken her lantern and walked out through the grass, and she had seen 2 men with the Harker brand on their saddle bags cutting her fence line and driving her cattle south, toward Harker's land. She had recognized one of the men. His name was Pete Digby, and he had a scar running from his left ear to his jaw that was impossible to miss. She had shouted at them and they had ridden hard into the dark, but she had seen enough. She had gone to Sheriff Cal the very next morning. The sheriff had listened with the polite but distant expression of a man who has already decided something before you finish speaking, and he had told her he would look into it. He had not looked into it. 3 more of her cattle had gone missing since then, and when she had pressed him again, he had suggested that perhaps she had miscounted, or perhaps the cattle had wandered off through the broken fence, or perhaps she was simply too distressed from the long years of managing the homestead alone to be remembering things correctly. And so Elvira had done something that had taken more courage than she had known she possessed. She had gone to the men who gathered each week at the Dusty Spur for their informal town council meeting, and she had asked to be heard. The room was full tonight. There were ranchers and farmhands, merchants and drifters passing through. There was old Doc Purvis in his stained coat, and the blacksmith Samuel Rowe with his enormous arms folded across his chest, and the widow Calloway who ran the dry goods store and who was watching Elvira with sharp, sympathetic eyes. There were perhaps 40 people crowded into the saloon, some sitting, some standing along the walls, and at the very back of the room, at a table by himself near the door, sat a man Elvira had seen around town but did not know well. He was leaning back in his chair, his hat low, a cup of something untouched on the table before him. He was tall even sitting down, lean in the way of men who spent most of their days in the saddle. He had a quiet look about him, not unfriendly, but reserved in a way that made him seem like a man who kept his own counsel. His name, she recalled someone mentioning once, was Isaiah Ford. He had been working odd jobs around Redrock Flats for the past 3 months, fixing fences and breaking horses for whoever needed it. He did not seem to belong to anyone in particular, which in Redrock Flats meant he did not quite fit. Elvira pulled her attention back to the front of the room, where Sheriff Cal was looking at her with that same dismissive patience. "You have the floor, Mrs. Grady," he said, in the tone of a man doing a woman a generous favor. Elvira took a breath. She spoke clearly, not loud but firmly, and she told them everything. She told them about the night she had seen her cattle being driven off, about Pete Digby and the scar and the Harker brand on the saddle bags. She told them about the 3 more head that had gone missing since, and how her herd had been at 30 head before Thomas died and was now at 19, and how at that rate she would not survive the winter. She told them that she had gone to the sheriff and that nothing had been done. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Claude Harker laughed. It was not a loud laugh, but it was a deliberate one, the kind of laugh designed to make a person feel small. He spread his big hands on the table and looked around the room with the ease of a man in complete control of his surroundings. "I am sorry for Mrs. Grady's troubles," he said, his voice smooth and well-practiced at sounding reasonable. "I truly am. Losing cattle is a hard thing, especially for a woman managing a place alone. But I have to say plainly, and without any pleasure in it, that what she is saying is not true. None of my men have been anywhere near her property. Pete Digby was at my bunkhouse every night last month. I can have 3 men swear to it." "I know what I saw," Elvira said, keeping her voice level. "I'm sure you believe that," Harker said, and the words dripped with condescension, polished and poisonous. "But grief does things to a person's mind. We've all seen it. And managing alone as long as she has, in the dark in the middle of the night, it would be easy for anyone to misremember a face or misread a mark on a saddle bag." "I did not misread anything," Elvira said. Sheriff Cal held up a hand. "Now, I don't think Mr. Harker is saying you're a dishonest woman, Mrs. Grady. He's simply suggesting that you may have been mistaken." "He is calling me a liar," Elvira said, and her voice did not shake, even though something inside her chest was beginning to crack. "And he knows I am telling the truth." There was a murmur through the room. Some of it sounded sympathetic, but most of it sounded uncomfortable, the kind of sound a crowd makes when it wants the difficult thing in front of it to simply go away. Elvira looked around the room and saw the familiar arithmetic of power adding itself up in the air. Harker employed too many of these men, owed favors to too many others, had bought too much goodwill over too many years. Nobody was going to stand up and call him a liar in return. Nobody except, it turned out, the quiet man at the back of the room. Isaiah Ford did not raise his hand or stand dramatically or do anything that called attention to itself. He simply said, in a voice that was low and unhurried but somehow cut straight through the noise of the room, "I believe her." The words landed like a stone dropping into still water. Several heads turned. Claude Harker's eyes narrowed. "I beg your pardon," Sheriff Cal said. Isaiah Ford pushed his hat back slightly from his face and looked at the sheriff with calm, steady eyes. He was perhaps 30 years old, with a jaw that was set and honest-looking and dark eyes that held the kind of patience you only developed from a great deal of time spent watching and waiting. He did not look hostile. He did not look afraid. He looked simply like a man who had thought carefully about what he was saying and meant every word of it. "I said I believe her," Isaiah repeated. "I was riding the North Trail 3 weeks ago, late, coming back from the Dawson farm where I had been hired to mend their east fence. I saw 2 men driving cattle south from the direction of the Grady property. I did not know whose cattle they were at the time, so I said nothing. But one of the men had a scar on his face, left side, running from here to here. He traced his finger along his own jaw in the lamplight, and the saddle bags I could see clearly enough. Harker's brand." The room was very still. Claude Harker had a different expression now. The ease was still there on the surface, but beneath it something had shifted, hardened. He looked at Isaiah Ford the way a man looks at something unexpected and unwelcome. "I don't know who you are," Harker said slowly, "but you are either mistaken or you are lying, and either way, your word doesn't carry much weight in this town." "My word carries the same weight as any honest man's," Isaiah said without heat, "and I am not mistaken." Sheriff Cal cleared his throat and said that he would look into the matter again, which everyone in the room understood to mean that he probably would not. But something had shifted anyway. When Elvira walked out of the dusty spur that night, she walked out knowing that at least one person in Redrock Flats had stood up and said that what she knew to be true was true. She could not have explained why that should matter so much to her when the practical outcome was so uncertain, but it did. It mattered more than she expected. Outside, the night air was cool and sharp with the smell of sage and the distant, dry promise of rain that would never come. The stars over New Mexico territory in October were a spectacular and indifferent blaze across the black sky. Elvira stood outside the saloon for a moment, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders and trying to decide whether she should feel more hopeful or less hopeful than she had when she walked in. She heard the door open behind her and the sound of boots on the wooden boardwalk. "Mrs. Grady." She turned. Isaiah Ford was standing a few feet away, his hat in his hand, which struck her as unexpectedly courteous. Up close he was even taller than he had appeared at the back of the room, and his face had a quality of careful attention to it, as though he was the kind of person who noticed things thoroughly. "I wanted to make sure you had a safe ride home," he said. "My horse is at the rail. I can ride out as far as the Grady property if you don't object to the company." Elvira looked at him for a moment. She was not a woman who accepted help easily, especially not from strangers, and especially not after 2 years of managing everything herself. But she was also not a woman who let pride prevent good sense, and riding alone at night with Harker's men in the territory felt considerably less safe than it had before this evening. "I don't object," she said. They rode in silence for a while, which suited them both, it seemed. The road from town toward her homestead was a pale ribbon in the moonlight, cutting through the scrub and the low hills. Elvira's horse, a reliable older mare named Biscuit, plodded with patient steadiness. Isaiah's horse was a lean black gelding that moved with a kind of quiet authority. "You did not have to do that," Elvira said finally when they were perhaps halfway to her property. "Stand up and say what you said." "No," Isaiah agreed, "but it was true and it needed saying." "It may have made things harder for you," she said. "Harker is not a man who forgets." "Neither am I," Isaiah said. There was something in the simplicity of that answer that struck her. It was not a boast. It was just a fact, stated plainly, and she appreciated the honesty of it. "You said you saw them 3 weeks ago," Elvira said. "You have been in Redrock Flats for 3 months, they say. Why did you not say something sooner?" "Because I did not know whose cattle they were or where they were going," Isaiah said. "In this territory, getting in the middle of another man's cattle business without the full picture will get you shot before you can explain yourself. I needed to understand the situation before I opened my mouth." He glanced at her sideways. "Tonight gave me the full picture." She nodded slowly, seeing the logic of that. "And now you have opened your mouth," she said, "and you may well regret it." "I regret nothing I have said in my life that was true," he said. Elvira found herself studying him in the thin moonlight, this quiet man who had come from nowhere, and said the one thing she had been desperate to hear. She did not know his story. She did not know where he was from or why he was in Redrock Flats doing odd jobs when he looked like a man who was capable of a great deal more. There was something restrained about him, she thought, like a river that had been running underground for a long time. They reached the gate of her property, and she pulled Biscuit to a stop. The house was a modest adobe structure with a covered porch, dark now, the corrals to the right where the remaining cattle moved quietly in the night. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in a way that went deeper than just the escort home. "You are welcome," Isaiah said. He replaced his hat on his head and looked at the house for a moment, then back at her. "Be careful, Mrs. Grady. Harker is not going to leave this alone." "No," she said. "He is not." She rode through the gate and did not look back, though she heard him sit there on his horse for another minute before she heard the sound of hooves moving back toward town. Elvira did not sleep well that night. She lay awake in the quiet house, listening to the sounds of the land around her, the distant cry of a coyote, the creak of the wood settling in the cold, the occasional movement of cattle in the corral. She thought about Thomas, who had been dead 2 years now and whose absence still felt like a shape in the room with her at night. She thought about the homestead, which she had fought to keep through the drought of the summer before last and the hard winter of last year, and which she was not going to surrender now, not to Claude Harker's greed or to the town's comfortable willingness to believe a rich man over a widow woman. She thought about Isaiah Ford and what it had felt like when he said he believed her. She fell asleep eventually, just before the sky began to lighten in the east. In the morning she rose early, as she always did, and went out to check the cattle. 19 head, all present. She fed them and checked the fence line along the north section, where it had been cut before, and found no new damage. The morning was cold and brilliant, the kind of New Mexico autumn morning that reminded you why people had come out here in the first place, when the sky was so blue it almost hurt to look at, and the air tasted clean. She was coming back toward the house when she saw Isaiah Ford ride up to the gate. He dismounted and stood at the fence, hat in hand again, waiting to be invited in rather than simply coming through, and she found that she noticed that detail, the respect in it. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied, walking toward him. "You are up early." "I thought I should come out and look at that fence line with you if you are willing," he said. Damage on a fence line tells a story sometimes about the direction they came from and how they got the cattle through. It might help to know the full pattern. It was a practical and useful thing to offer, and Elvira said yes. They spent the next hour walking the full perimeter of the north section together, and Isaiah showed her things she had not thought to look for. The way the cut wire had been bent in a particular direction that indicated the cutters had approached from the creek bed to the west rather than from the main road, which meant they had been coming across Harker's own land by a back route, and the way the grass had been disturbed in a pattern consistent with cattle being pushed rather than wandering. "They knew exactly what they were doing, and they have done it before," Isaiah said, crouching by the fence post and examining the wire. "This cut is clean, professional." "Pete Digby has been working cattle his whole life," Elvira said. "He knows his business." Isaiah looked up at her. The morning light was full on his face, and she could see him clearly for the first time, the angular lines of his jaw, the depth and steadiness of his dark eyes, the way his expression held a kind of focused seriousness that she found, unexpectedly, comforting. He was not looking at her with pity or with the particular brand of protective condescension that men often showed toward women managing alone. He was looking at her the way he might look at any person he was working alongside, with simple professional respect. "Did your husband leave any documentation of the herd count?" he asked. "Bill of sale, inventory, anything like that?" Elvira stopped. "Yes," she said slowly. "Thomas kept meticulous records. He had a ledger showing the original count and the dates. Yes." "Then we have something," Isaiah said, standing and dusting off his knees. "A ledger with documented dates and numbers is harder to dismiss than a woman's word alone. If we can put the ledger together with my testimony and the physical evidence on the fence line, that is a case that is harder to laugh away." Elvira looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. The question seemed to catch him slightly off guard, not in an uncomfortable way, but as though he had not expected her to ask it directly. He looked out over the flat scrub land to the north, toward the distant blue bulk of the mountains, and was quiet for a moment. "Because what is happening to you is wrong," he said, "and because I was in the right place at the right time to see it and say so. I am not in the habit of walking away from something I can do something about." He looked back at her. "And because you did not deserve to stand up there alone in front of all those people and be called a liar by a man who knew perfectly well you were telling the truth." The directness of it, the plainness, hit her somewhere unexpectedly deep. She had spent 2 years being careful not to need anyone, training herself out of the habit of leaning on another person, and now this quiet stranger with his steady eyes was offering something, and she did not quite know what to do with the feeling it produced in her. "Come inside," she said. "I will show you the ledger, and there is coffee." The inside of Elvira's house was plain and clean, and spoke of a life organized around practical purpose. There were good curtains at the windows and a braided rug on the floor, a table with 4 chairs, and a pot-bellied stove that was already going, throwing comfortable heat across the room. On the shelf above the fireplace were a few books and a framed tintype photograph of Thomas, serious-faced in the way of all photographic portraits of the time, and a small vase with dried wildflowers in it. Elvira produced the ledger from the box beneath Thomas's old desk, a careful, water-stained book in which Thomas had recorded every head of cattle, every date of purchase, every mark and brand in his precise, slightly cramped handwriting. Isaiah sat at the table and read it while Elvira made coffee, and when she set the cup in front of him, he did not look up right away but said thank you in a way that suggested he meant it. "This is good," he said, when he had read through the relevant pages. "This clearly shows you had 30 head as of March of 1881. Combined with what I saw and the physical evidence on the fence line, this establishes a pattern. The question is whether there is anyone in this town with the authority and the backbone to act on it." Elvira sat down across from him with her own cup. "Sheriff Cal answers to Harker," she said flatly. "Everyone knows it. Harker extended him a personal loan 2 years ago to cover his gambling debts, and Cal has been grateful ever since in a way that expresses itself as blindness." Isaiah nodded slowly, unsurprised. "What about the territorial marshal? Is there a marshal assigned to this district?" Elvira considered. "Marshal Holt out of Las Cruces. He comes through every few months. He was last through in August." "He may be due again soon," Isaiah said. "If we can document everything and have it ready when he comes through, we go over Cal's head entirely." It was a plan. It was a real, concrete, workable plan, and for the first time in what felt like a very long time, Elvira felt something shift in her chest, something that was the beginning of genuine hope rather than the grim determination she had been running on. "You have done this sort of thing before," she said. It was not quite a question. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at the table for a moment. "I worked law enforcement in Texas for several years," he said, "before coming here." "Why did you leave?" There was a pause, not uncomfortable exactly, but considering. "My wife died," he said quietly, 3 years ago, fever. After that, I needed to be somewhere different for a while." He looked up at her briefly. "You understand something of that, I think." The simplicity with which he said it, without self-pity but with honest weight, opened something between them, an understanding of a particular kind of loss that people who had not experienced it could not fully reach. "Yes," Elvira said, "I understand that exactly." They were quiet for a moment, and it was the comfortable quiet of two people who had recognized something of themselves in each other. After that morning, Isaiah began coming out to the Grady property regularly. It began as a practical matter. He was helping her document the evidence, riding the fence lines with her, keeping watch some nights from a respectful distance near the north section. But it became something else gradually, in the way that things between two lonely, capable people who respect each other tend to become something else, without any single moment you could point to as the turning point. He took on some of the harder maintenance work around the property, things that required more hands than one woman alone could manage, repairing the sagging section of the main corral fence, reinforcing the gate posts on the south side. He did these things without being asked and without being sentimental about it, simply showing up with tools and working until the work was done. Elvira found herself cooking for two instead of one without making a conscious decision to do so, and found that she did not mind. They talked. They talked in the evenings on the porch when the work was done, watching the colors drain out of the western sky in long streaks of amber and rose. He told her about growing up in East Texas, the son of a farmer who had moved there after the war, the particular hardships and simplicities of that life. He told her about the years he had spent as a deputy, and then as a marshal's assistant, learning that the law was a tool that worked well when the people wielding it were honest and worked very badly when they were not. He told her about his wife, Clara, who had been funny and sharp-minded, and who had died in the second week of August 3 years ago with the fever that had also taken several other people in their town, and how he had buried her and then ridden west because he did not know what else to do. Elvira told him about Thomas, about how they had come out to New Mexico Territory in 1878 from Missouri, when Thomas had seen an opportunity in the land, how they had built the adobe house together with their own hands over one long summer, how Thomas had been bitten by a rattlesnake on a trail ride in October of 1880 and had died 3 days later despite everything Doc Purvis had done, and how she had sat beside his bed those 3 days holding his hand and talking to him even after he could no longer respond, telling him that she was going to be all right, that she was going to hold onto what they had built because she needed to believe it herself. She did not cry telling it. She had done all the crying she had to do about Thomas, and what was left was something cleaner and more settled. Isaiah listened the way he did everything, completely and without distraction, and when she finished he did not say anything for a long moment but just nodded, looking out at the darkening land. "You have done something remarkable," he said finally. "I have done what needed doing," she said. "Those are not always the same thing," he said, "but in your case they are." It was in these conversations that she began to see him fully, not just as the man who had stood up for her in the saloon, not just as a useful pair of hands, but as a person of specific and interesting depth. He was not a man who said much, but everything he said was considered. He had opinions about things, about the way the territory's land grants were being handled, about the treatment of the Mexican families who had been farming some of this land for generations before Americans arrived, about the particular injustice of a system that protected the interests of men like Harker, while ignoring the legitimate claims of people who had less money and less social standing. He spoke about these things without heat, but with a quiet conviction that told her he had thought about them seriously and for a long time. She liked him. She more than liked him, and the recognition of that fact arrived one morning when she caught herself looking at the road from town and feeling a specific anticipatory warmth at the thought of his horse appearing through the scrub, and she put the feeling away carefully and went back to her work without examining it too closely, because there were more pressing matters to attend to. Claude Harker was not, as he never was, going to simply let things rest. 12 days after the meeting at the Dusty Spur, Elvira rode into town for supplies and found Pete Digby standing outside the dry goods store, leaning against the post in a way that suggested he had been waiting for her specifically. He was a compact, dark-haired man with the scar on his jaw that she had described, and he looked at her with the flat expression of a man delivering a message he had been told to deliver. "Morning, Mrs. Grady," he said, tipping his hat with a mockery of politeness. "Mr. Harker wanted me to pass along his regards. He also wanted you to know that he is a very forgiving man, and that he holds no ill feeling toward you for what happened at the Spur the other night. He understands that you have been under a great deal of stress." "How generous of him," Elvira said, and went to tie biscuit at the rail. "He also said," Pete Digby continued, following her slightly, "that he would be very open to a conversation about the Grady property. Given that you are struggling with it alone, he would make a fair offer, more than fair, enough to set you up comfortably somewhere else." Elvira turned and looked at Pete Digby with an expression that she had developed over 2 years of managing a homestead alone in hostile territory, one that communicated clearly and economically that she was not impressed, not frightened, and not going to do what he was suggesting. "Tell Mr. Harker," she said, "that the Grady property is not for sale, and that my position on that is fixed." You can also tell him that I know exactly what he has been doing, and so does at least one other person, and we have been documenting it carefully." Pete Digby's expression shifted slightly, just a tightening around the eyes. "I think that is a decision you may come to regret," he said. "I think you have delivered your message," she said. "Good day, Mr. Digby." She went inside to get her supplies, and her hands were perfectly steady on the counter while she was ordering them. When she told Isaiah about the encounter that evening, his jaw tightened and he was quiet for a moment. "He is escalating," Isaiah said. "First the cattle, then the public accusation, now a direct approach. He is trying to push you into selling before the marshal comes through." "When do you think Marshal Holt will come through?" Elvira asked. "I sent a letter to Las Cruces 2 weeks ago," Isaiah said. He had not mentioned this before, and she looked at him quickly. He met her gaze. "I did not want to tell you in case it came to nothing. But there was a postal rider going that way, and I wrote to the marshal's office explaining the situation and requesting that he make Redrock Flats his next stop rather than waiting out his regular schedule." "You did that without telling me," she said, and her voice had a careful quality to it. "Yes," he said. "I should have told you. I am sorry for that." She was quiet for a moment, deciding how she felt about it. She had spent 2 years making every decision herself, and the instinct to object to someone else acting on her behalf without consultation was strong. But she looked at his face, at the complete absence of anything proprietary or controlling in it, just the slight self-reproach of a man who genuinely thought he should have consulted her, and she found that the objection dissolved. "Thank you," she said, "for doing it, and for telling me now." He looked at her with something that was not quite relief, but was in that direction. "I figure Holt will come through within the next 3 to 4 weeks if the letter reached him in good time." "Then we need to hold on for 3 to 4 weeks, she said. "Then we hold on," he said simply. They held on. Harker made one more attempt at quiet intimidation. One of his men rode past the property twice one morning at a slow, deliberate pace that was clearly meant to be noticed. Isaiah had been out by the north fence and had watched the rider pass without responding in any way except to note the brand on the horse. The rider did not come again. Elvira threw herself into the daily work of the homestead with focused intensity, because work had always been her best response to fear and uncertainty. She was up before dawn, out with the cattle, making repairs, keeping the books, doing everything with the same careful precision that Thomas had admired in her, and that she had since discovered was simply her natural mode of being in the world. Isaiah helped, and more the lines between what was help and what was something else began to blur pleasantly. He ate dinner at her table more evenings than not. He began keeping some of his tools in her barn, not dramatically, not with any announcement, just because that was where they were needed. He got into the habit of making the coffee in the morning if he arrived early, and she got into the habit of not objecting to it. One evening, about 2.5 weeks after the meeting at the saloon, they were sitting on the porch after dinner watching a thunderstorm build over the mountains to the west, the lightning walking silently in the purple sky, too far away to hear yet. The air had the electric, metallic smell of a storm that was coming and taking its time about it. Elvira had been looking at the lightning, but she became aware that Isaiah was looking at her. She turned her head and found him watching her with an expression that was unguarded in a way she had not seen before, open and a little uncertain, which surprised her because he was a man who rarely looked uncertain about anything. "I want to say something," he said. "Say it," she said. "I don't want you to think that what I have been doing here," he started and paused, beginning again more carefully. "I don't want you to think I have been out here every day because I felt obligated, or because it was the right thing to do, though it is, or because I did not think you could manage alone, because you clearly can. I want you to know that I have been out here every day because I wanted to be." Elvira was quiet, holding the warmth of that statement carefully, the way you hold something delicate. "I think about you," he continued, and the plainness of it was devastating in the best possible way. "Considerably more than I thought I would think about any person again when I left Texas, and I think you should know that. I am not in the habit of being dishonest about things that matter, and this matters." The lightning illuminated the mountains again, closer now, and the first low roll of thunder reached them, soft and distant. "Isaiah," she said, and his name felt comfortable in her mouth, which she noticed. "You do not have to say anything," he said quickly. "I am not asking for anything. I just thought you should know." "I was going to say," she said, "that I think about you too. Rather more than I expected to think about a quiet man who came in from the back of a saloon and said 3 words. He looked at her, and his mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile yet but was getting there, slow and genuine. 3 words, he said. "I believe her," she quoted back to him. "They were good words," he said. "They were the best words anyone has said to me in a very long time," she told him, and she meant it in every possible sense. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the porch chair. Not dramatically, just a warm, steady enfolding of her fingers in his. And she let him. And they sat like that while the storm moved closer and the thunder grew until it was overhead, and the rain came down in a great silver curtain across the flat land, and neither of them moved inside for a long time. Marshal Elias Holt arrived in Redrock Flats on a Thursday morning in late October, which was 23 days after Isaiah had sent the letter. He was a tall man in his early 50s with a long face that had been deeply carved by wind and experience, and he wore his badge with the quiet certainty of a man who had been doing the job long enough to know exactly what it required of him. He came with a deputy, a young man named Alvarez, and they rode into town without fanfare and went directly to the sheriff's office. Elvira and Isaiah were in town that morning, having come in early with a full copy of the documentation they had assembled. The ledger, Isaiah's written and witnessed account of what he had seen, a detailed description of the fence damage with specific measurements and directional notes, and a timeline that connected the missing cattle to specific dates on which Pete Digby had been seen in the area. The meeting in Sheriff Cal's office was not comfortable for anyone except possibly Elvira, who had been waiting for it for weeks. Marshal Holt read through everything with methodical care while Cal sat behind his desk, with the look of a man watching something he cannot stop approaching him. Isaiah stood to one side, solid and quiet, answering the marshal's questions directly and without embellishment. "You are prepared to testify to this under oath," the marshal said to Isaiah. "Yes, sir," Isaiah said. Holt looked at the ledger again, then at Elvira. "Mrs. Grady, you are telling me you have lost 11 head of cattle over approximately 8 months, and you have direct witness testimony placing the defendant's men on your property." "That is correct," Elvira said. "And Sheriff Cal, you received this complaint and took no action." Cal's red face had gone somewhat redder. "I looked into it. When?" Holt said. The silence that followed was answer enough. Marshal Holt moved with the focused efficiency of a man who did not waste time once he had decided on a course. That same afternoon, Pete Digby was brought in for questioning, and when confronted with Isaiah's specific and detailed testimony and the documentation of the fence damage, the elaborate alibi that Harker's 3 men had been prepared to swear to began to develop significant and obvious holes. By the following morning, Digby had made the calculation that his loyalty to Harker was worth considerably less than his own freedom, and he provided a full account of what had happened. 6 separate occasions on which he and another hand named Rowe had cut Elvira's fence and driven cattle onto Harker's land, where they had been mixed into the larger herd and rebranded. Claude Harker was arrested on a Friday morning. Elvira was standing at the gate of her property when the marshal and his deputy rode past with Harker between them, hands bound. Harker looked at her as he passed, and the expression on his face was ugly and cold, a man who had always had the power to arrange things to his advantage discovering that it had run out. Elvira looked back at him steadily and said nothing, because there was nothing she needed to say. Isaiah was standing beside her at the gate. He said nothing either, but she felt the warmth of his presence there, solid and certain. "It is over," she said, when the riders had disappeared down the road toward town. "It is over," he agreed. She had to go inside for a few minutes then, not because she was upset but because she needed to stand in her own kitchen and feel the solidity of it around her, and let the long, taut tension of the past months release itself quietly. She stood at the window and looked out at the land that she and Thomas had claimed, and that she had held through every possible difficulty. And she felt something that was not grief exactly, and not triumph exactly, but somewhere in the dignified and quiet space between them. When she came back out to the porch, Isaiah was sitting on the step with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim in the way she had noticed he did when he was thinking. She sat down beside him, close enough that their arms touched and did not move away. "What will happen to Harker?" she asked. "Cattle theft on that scale is a serious matter under territorial law," Isaiah said. "He will face charges in Santa Fe. He is unlikely to walk away from it, not with Digby's testimony and everything we have documented. Even with his money, that is a lot to overcome. And Sheriff Cal." "Holt made it very clear to Cal that his position is not secure," Isaiah said. "Whether the county sees fit to remove him will take some time, but Holt is filing a formal report with the territorial office about Cal's failure to act. It will not go nowhere." Elvira nodded. She thought about the other families in the territory, the smaller ranchers and the Mexican farming families and the homesteaders who had no one to stand up for them, and she felt the weight of it, the particular heaviness of knowing that the system that had failed her was still failing other people, and that one victory, however satisfying, was not the same as justice across the board. But she had won the thing that was hers to win, and that had to be enough for now. "Isaiah," she said. He looked at her. "What do you intend to do now?" she asked. "Now that the reason that brought you to this property every day has been resolved?" He was quiet for a moment, but there was nothing uncertain in his face. He had clearly thought about this. "That depends," he said, "on what you would like me to do." "And if I told you," she said carefully, "that I would like you to stay?" He turned toward her on the step, and the look on his face was so open and so warm that it was almost startling on a man who normally kept so much of himself carefully contained. "Then I would stay," he said simply. "There is a great deal of work on this property," she said, "and I have been managing it alone for 2 years." "I know," he said, "and I am not looking for someone to manage it for me," she said clearly. "I am looking for someone to manage it alongside." "I know that too," he said, "and that is exactly what I am offering." She looked at him for a long moment, this quiet man who had walked into the back of a saloon and changed the direction of her life with 3 words. She thought about the evenings on the porch and the mornings at the fence line and the way he made coffee and the way he listened with his whole attention and the way he had held her hand in the rain. "All right," she said. "Then stay." He reached up and tucked a strand of hair that had come loose back behind her ear, the touch so gentle and so natural that it did not feel like the first time he had done it, but like something they had always done, and he looked at her for a moment with everything plain and warm in his face. "I intend to," he said, and then he kissed her, softly and with no hurry whatsoever, the way a man kisses someone when he means it as a beginning and not an ending. The weeks that followed were busy and full, and had about them a quality of rightness that Elvira had not felt for a very long time. She and Isaiah settled into the patterns of 2 people who complement each other well, which is to say that the work divided naturally according to ability and preference, and there was very little friction and a great deal of the particular satisfaction that comes from working beside someone you trust completely. He moved his few possessions into the small room at the back of the house that had been Thomas's study, which she had felt was the honest and practical thing to do, and which also required a certain courage on both their parts, because this was 1882 in a small New Mexico territory town, where people paid attention to the arrangements of their neighbors. But the widow Calloway, who had sharp eyes and a warm heart, made it known that she thought it was the right and sensible thing, and Doc Purvis said nothing either way, but accepted a dinner invitation to the property and left looking well-fed and content. And since Harker and his influence were considerably reduced in the community now, there was nobody left with the power or the interest to make things difficult. Marshal Holt's letter confirming the charges against Harker arrived in November, along with a personal note to Elvira commending her documentation and telling her that her cattle, the 11 head that could be identified from Thomas's ledger records, would be returned to her from Harker's herd as part of the judgment. This was more than she had expected, and she stood in the doorway reading the letter twice, and then called Isaiah in from where he was working on the corral roof. He read it and looked up at her with a slow, wide smile, the kind of full smile she did not see often from him because he was sparing with them, which made them worth considerably more. 30 head again, she said. And then some, he said, because they had also had 4 calves born in October. She laughed, which was a sound she found herself making more often now, and he folded the letter and handed it back to her and then put his arms around her, and she let herself simply lean into him for a moment, which was something she had been practicing and which was getting easier. Isaiah formally proposed to her on a December evening, which was 6 weeks after Harker's arrest and 3 weeks after the letter from the marshal. He did it quietly, on the porch where they had sat through the storm in October, the air now cold and sharp, and the stars enormous overhead. He did not have a ring, which he acknowledged with a straightforwardness she appreciated. He said he would get one when the next supply wagon came through from Santa Fe if she would tell him what she would like, because he was not in the habit of deciding things for her without consulting her. She said yes before he finished asking. They were married by the circuit preacher in January of 1883 in the widow Calloway's parlor, which was the warmest and most welcoming space in Red Rock Flats for such an occasion. The widow Calloway cried, which she said was entirely appropriate, and she was not apologizing for it. Doc Purvis served as one of the witnesses, and the young blacksmith Samuel Rowe served as the other. There was cake that the widow Calloway had been secretly baking for a week, and coffee, and a bottle of good whiskey that Isaiah had been saving for an occasion. It was a small, honest, warm ceremony, and when the preacher pronounced them married and Isaiah kissed her in front of their small audience, Elvira felt that the life she was beginning was not a replacement for the life she had before, not a correction or a consolation, but a continuation in the truest sense, the next part of something that had always been moving toward itself. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was cold but manageable. The herd was strong, the fence lines were maintained, and the Grady property, which had been stretched thin and struggling for 2 years, began to breathe a little easier with 2 sets of capable hands working it. Isaiah turned out to have a gift for working with cattle that went beyond simple competence, a patient, instinctive quality that the animals responded to, and the herd did well under his attention. Claude Harker was convicted in Santa Fe in February on multiple counts of cattle theft, and 1 count of attempting to defraud a homesteader of her land. His fine was considerable, and his standing in the community was irreparably damaged. Several of the families that had been under his thumb found that the atmosphere in Red Rock Flats had changed, that it was possible to speak plainly and be heard without the weight of Harker's influence bearing down on every conversation. This was a subtle thing, the way such changes always were, but it was real and it mattered. Pete Digby served a shorter sentence in exchange for his testimony, and when he was released, he did not return to Red Rock Flats. The other hand, Rowe, had left the territory entirely when he heard what was coming, and was not found. Sheriff Dunmore Cal was formally censured by the territorial office and resigned from his position in March, before he could be removed. The new sheriff was a younger man named Patterson, who had no particular history of obligation to any wealthy local rancher, and who turned out to be honest in the straightforward, unglamorous way that made for a decent lawman. Spring came to New Mexico territory in its particular way, not soft and gradual like spring in the east, but sudden and golden, the desert flowering in brief, vivid urgency after the winter rains. Elvira planted the kitchen garden that she had not had the time or the energy to tend properly for 2 years, and found that she had more enthusiasm for it than she remembered having. She found that she had enthusiasm for a great many things that she had let go quiet during the years of managing alone. She had always loved to read, and now in the evenings, when the work was done and they sat together on the porch or by the fire, she read aloud sometimes, and Isaiah listened with the same complete attention he brought to everything, occasionally asking a question or making an observation that showed he was genuinely engaged with whatever she was reading. He did not read as voraciously as she did, but he had a thoughtful relationship with the books she pressed into his hands, and he returned them with comments that she found herself thinking about for days. She found that she had let the business of the homestead expand in her mind to fill all the available space, and that now there was room for other things. Room for the long conversations they had in the evenings about everything and nothing. Room to notice the beauty of the land around her in a way that she had been too tired and too worried to notice for a long time. Room to simply be happy, which she had almost forgot was a state available to her. By summer of 1883, Elvira knew she was going to have a child. She told Isaiah one morning in June when they were at the breakfast table, and she watched his face with curiosity, not sure exactly what she was going to see there. What she saw was a kind of overwhelmed softness, a man who had not allowed himself to expect this, and was not quite sure what to do with the fact of it. He reached across the table and took her hand with the same quiet certainty he had shown that first night when he had ridden her home from the saloon, the same essential quality of simply being present and meaning it. "Are you well?" he asked. "You are feeling all right." "I am feeling very well," she said. "Doc Purvis confirmed it last week. He says everything looks healthy." "You saw Doc Purvis last week and you are only telling me now," he said, and there was something in his voice that was the very gentle beginning of a complaint. "I wanted to be certain first," she said. He looked at her for a moment and then shook his head slightly with a small smile, accepting this, because he understood that she was a woman who needed to be certain of things before she brought them to other people, and he had learned that about her without trying to change it. "A baby," he said softly, as though testing the reality of the word. "A baby," she confirmed. He stood up from the table and came around to where she was sitting and crouched down to her level, taking both her hands in his and looking at her with everything entirely open and visible in his face. "You are going to be magnificent at this," he said. "You are going to be the best mother this territory has ever seen." "You do not know that," she said, though she was smiling. "I know you," he said. "That is enough." She leaned forward and kissed him, and he put his hand gently against her cheek, and outside the morning light was building over the flat land, and the cattle were moving peacefully in the corral, and the kitchen garden was green and growing, and everything felt, with a completeness that she did not take for granted, profoundly and exactly right. Their son was born in February of 1884, during a brief warm spell that felt like the land offering something generous. He was a healthy, loud, substantial child with his father's dark eyes and his mother's determined expression, and he announced his arrival in the world with a vigor that made Doc Purvis chuckle and declare him the most opinionated newborn he had seen in recent memory. They named him Thomas Isaiah Ford, which said everything that needed to be said about where they had come from and where they were going. The widow Calloway came and stayed for the first 2 weeks to help, which was a kindness that Elvira accepted with considerably less reluctance than she would have accepted help 2 years earlier, which represented a genuine change in her. She had learned, over the course of the past year, that accepting the help of people who cared about you was not a weakness but a grace, and that there was a difference between dependence and community that she had been conflating. Isaiah, it turned out, was extraordinary with the baby, in the particular way of men who have been patient all their lives with things that required gentleness. He could quiet Thomas within minutes when the baby was fractious, and he did the early morning and late night wakings without complaint, appearing in the lamplight with a look of complete focused attention that was exactly the same expression he wore when he was doing anything important, which communicated to Elvira without words that this was, to him, as important as anything. By the spring of 1884, the herd had grown to 38 head, with more calves expected. The property was in the best condition it had been in since Thomas Grady first built it, and Isaiah had begun expanding it cautiously, extending the fence line to incorporate a section of good grazing land to the west that had been unclaimed. They filed the claim properly with the territorial office, with the new sheriff's assistance, and it went through without complication. Red Rock Flats itself was changing, the way small frontier towns always change when the particular stranglehold of a single powerful figure is removed. New businesses came in the spring of 1884. A milliner opened next to the dry goods store, and a proper schoolteacher was engaged for the children who had been getting sporadic education from whoever could be persuaded to take it on. There were more families in town now, drawn by the improved atmosphere of a place that felt, if not exactly safe, then at least fair in a way it had not been before. Elvira went into town more regularly than she had during the Harker years, when the atmosphere had felt consistently hostile to her presence. She became a regular at the Wednesday evening town council meetings, not because she had a specific complaint, but because she had decided that if these meetings were going to shape the community she lived in, she was going to be part of them. There were men who were uncomfortable with this, fewer than there used to be, and she met their discomfort with the same clear-eyed steadiness she brought to everything. Isaiah came with her sometimes and sometimes stayed home with Thomas, and on the occasions he came, he sat in the same place he always seemed to gravitate toward in public gatherings, toward the back, at a slight remove, watching and listening with those steady dark eyes. But everyone in Red Rock Flats knew now exactly who he was and what he was prepared to say when something needed saying, and his presence in the room, quiet as it was, carried a particular weight. "You will always sit at the back," she said to him one evening, riding home from a town meeting. "I can see everything from the back," he said. She shook her head, smiling, with Thomas sleeping against her shoulder in the wrap she had learned to use from a Mexican woman named S.R.A. Vargas, who was one of her neighbors now and with whom she had developed a good friendship. "You could see everything from the front as well." "The front is for people who need to be seen," he said. "I just need to see." That was so completely him that she laughed, and the sound of it went out into the cool spring night and dissolved into the stars overhead. In the autumn of 1884, something happened that Elvira had not anticipated, and which proved to be one of the most unexpectedly meaningful things that occurred in those years. A young woman named Rosa Cañedo came to her from one of the Mexican farming families on the eastern edge of the territory. A woman of 19 with a clear, intelligent face and a frightened look, who had heard that Elvira Grady had stood up in front of a room full of people who did not want to believe her and had been believed. Rosa had a problem of her own, a land claim dispute in which her family's homestead was being encroached on by a newly arrived Anglo rancher who was cutting their fence line and damaging their water access, and who was being ignored by everyone she had tried to appeal to, because Rosa Cañedo did not have Isaiah Ford standing up at the back of the room saying he believed her. Elvira listened to everything Rosa said with the same complete attention she had always wished someone would give her, and when Rosa finished, Elvira did not say she would look into it or suggest that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding. She went with Rosa to Marshal Holt's office, taking the documentation they had from Rosa's father about the original land claim, and she stood there and said clearly that she could confirm the pattern of behavior from her own experience and that this needed to be looked at properly. Isaiah came too, because she told him the situation, and he said without any hesitation that they should go. It took longer to resolve than Elvira's situation had, because Rosa's family had less documentation, and the rancher in question was more clever in his denials than Harker had been. But it was resolved, eventually, in the spring of 1885, in favor of the Cañedo family's claim, partly because of the evidence they had gathered with Elvira's help, and partly because Marshall Holt had developed a healthy respect for Elvira Grady's assessments of a situation and knew better than to dismiss them. Rosa Cañedo came to the Ford property the day the ruling came through and brought her mother and a pan of tamales, and there was an impromptu celebration in the kitchen that made Thomas, who was 14 months old and steadily becoming his own opinionated small person, pull himself upright against the table leg and beam at everyone with the comprehensive enthusiasm of a person who has just discovered that celebrations are extremely good. "He is going to be something," Rosa said, watching him. "He is already something," Elvira said fondly. "He has both of his parents in him," Rosa said. "That is a good combination." Elvira looked across the kitchen at Isaiah, who was talking to Rosa's father in his careful, halting Spanish, which he had been learning from the Cañedo family over the past several months, and which was improving slowly but noticeably. As she watched him, he said something that made Rosa's father laugh, a real, warm laugh, and then Isaiah looked up and caught Elvira's eye across the room, and the expression on his face was exactly the expression she had come to know as the one that meant her specifically, a particular warmth and attentiveness that he did not give to anyone else. She thought, not for the first time, about how improbable it was, that the thing which had changed her life had begun in the most difficult moment of it, standing up in a saloon full of people who did not want to hear her, speaking a truth that no one wanted to acknowledge, and then from the back of the room, 3 words: "I believe her." She had said once that they were the best words anyone had said to her in a very long time, and that remained true. But they had also been the beginning of something that she valued enormously, not just the words themselves, but what was behind them. A man of absolute, unpretentious honesty, who went through the world seeing clearly and saying what he saw, who had chosen her because she was who she was and not despite it. Their second child arrived in the spring of 1886, a daughter this time, born in April when the desert was briefly and spectacularly green after the rains. They named her Clara Elvira Ford, and the name said what it needed to say, honoring what had been lost and celebrating what was now present. Clara was a quieter child than Thomas had been, with her father's observant eyes and a thoughtful quality that suggested she was already, at a very young age, doing a great deal of internal processing. Thomas was 2 years old when Clara was born and approached his sister with the careful, skeptical scrutiny of a person who has been told about something and is still reserving judgment on whether it is as good as advertised. Within 2 weeks, he had decided she was excellent, and he became her most devoted protector, which made everyone around them smile, and which Isaiah watched with an expression of such transparent happiness that Elvira sometimes had to look away for a moment because it was almost too much all at once. The Grady Ford property, as people in town had begun calling it, though the deeds still read Grady because Elvira had made a point of keeping it that way and Isaiah had completely supported this, had grown substantially by 1886. The herd was 44 head. The kitchen garden was producing more than they could use, and they were selling the excess at market. And Isaiah had built a small addition to the east side of the house that gave them 2 proper bedrooms for the children, and a study that was neither of theirs specifically, but was shared, full of Elvira's books and Isaiah's careful records and documents. Life in Redrock Flats in 1886 was not without its difficulties and injustices, because frontier life was never without them, and Elvira had no illusions about the world being more just than it was. But it was a community that had become more honest and more accountable than it had been, in part because of what had happened in 1882, and in part because the people it contained had decided, collectively if imperfectly, to do better. The Cañedo family farmed their land without interference. The school had a full-time teacher who taught children of every background who arrived at her door. Sheriff Patterson did his job with fairness if not brilliance, and Marshal Holt's regular visits maintained a standard of accountability that Sheriff Cal had never permitted. On an evening in October of 1886, 4 years almost exactly from the night that Elvira had stood in the dusty spur and been called a liar, she and Isaiah sat on the porch in the cool air with Clara asleep inside and Thomas finally, after extensive negotiation, also in his bed. The land around them was the deep blue-gray of a New Mexico evening, the mountains purple in the distance, the first stars appearing overhead with their characteristic brilliance. Isaiah had one arm around her shoulders, and she was leaning into him in the easy, practiced way of long habit, and neither of them said anything for a while, because there was nothing that urgently needed saying. "Do you remember," she said eventually, "what you were thinking about when you were sitting at the back of the saloon that night?" "Which specific thing?" he said, "when you decided to speak." He was quiet for a moment, thinking back. "I was thinking," he said, "that I had been watching that room for 20 minutes and I had seen something I recognized. A person telling the truth, clearly and directly, in a room full of people who had already decided what they were going to believe. And I was thinking that the only question was whether I was going to be one more person sitting there staying quiet." "You could have stayed quiet," she said. "I could have," he said. It was not a comfortable thing to do, saying it. Harker was not a man you wanted looking at you the way he looked at me when I spoke. "Were you afraid?" "I was cautious," he said, "which is different from afraid. Afraid would have kept me quiet. Cautious just meant I said it carefully." She smiled. "You always say things carefully." "I try to," he said. "I have found that carefully said true things tend to hold up better than carelessly said ones." She turned her head and looked at him in the evening light. 4 years of his face, and she still found it interesting, this quality of attentive stillness that was simply him, that never quite went away even in laughter or in the various emotional weathers of daily life. He was 34 now, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there in 1882, and gray beginning at his temples, and she thought he was remarkably handsome in the way that men became handsome when their faces had caught up with their characters. "Isaiah," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it." He understood what she meant. He always understood what she meant, which was one of the enduring everyday miracles of their life together. "Thank you," he said, "for standing up there and saying the true thing in the first place. That took more courage than my 3 words did." "It cost me more," she agreed. "But then I had more to lose." "And what do you have now?" he asked, the old question in the cadence of a man who knows the answer but likes to hear it said. She looked out at the land, at the herd moving quietly in the far corral, at the kitchen garden put to bed for winter, at the house behind them where their children slept, at the stars beginning to fill the enormous sky overhead, at all of it, and then she looked back at him. "Everything," she said. He kissed her temple, warm and slow, and she leaned into him, and they stayed that way while the night came fully down over New Mexico territory, and the stars arranged themselves into their usual spectacular indifference, and the land around them settled into its deep, ancient quiet. Inside the house, Thomas stirred in his bed and then was still. Clara breathed softly in her cradle, small and new and certain. The cattle were calm. The fence lines held. The ledger on the study shelf had entries running right up to the present in 2 different but equally precise handwritings. Elvira Grady Ford had stood up in front of a room that did not want to hear her and said the true thing at considerable cost. Isaiah Ford had sat at the back of that room and said 3 words that had changed both their lives irrevocably and for the better. The injustice that had been done to her had been named and answered, not completely or perfectly, because the world was not a place where anything was completely or perfectly answered, but enough. Enough that the land was still hers, enough that the record was set straight, enough that 2 other families at least had found a measure of justice they might not otherwise have found. It was enough, and it was real, and it was theirs. The years rolled on in the way that good years do, marked not by single extraordinary events but by the accumulated texture of days lived fully and honestly. Thomas grew into a boy who had his mother's directness and his father's patience, which made him simultaneously the most straightforward and the most difficult person to argue with that anyone in Red Rock Flats had ever encountered. Clara grew into a girl who read everything she could get her hands on and had already informed her parents that she intended to be a doctor, which Doc Purvis, when told, said he thought was completely reasonable and that she could start learning from him whenever she liked. Isaiah continued to work the land with the same steady commitment he brought to everything, and continued to sit at the back of rooms, and continued to say the true thing when the true thing needed saying, which was more often than most people in Red Rock Flats would have preferred. He became, without ever seeking the position, a man whose opinion was sought on difficult questions because everyone knew that what he gave you in return was not what you wanted to hear but what was accurate, which was ultimately more useful. Elvira continued to attend the town council meetings, and in 1887 was asked to join the council formally, which had never before had a woman as a member. She accepted without ceremony, which was her way with everything, and she served on it for the next several years with the same precise, committed attention she gave to everything she undertook. She advocated particularly for the fair treatment of the Mexican and Hispanic families in the territory and for the expansion of the school's resources, and she won some of these arguments and lost others, and she continued to show up regardless. In the spring of 1889, a third child arrived, another son, whom they named James after Isaiah's father. James was from the beginning a cheerful and easygoing person in a household of intense, precise, somewhat serious people, and he had the effect of lightening the atmosphere in a way that everyone found they had apparently been needing without knowing it. He laughed at things easily, he charmed strangers instinctively, and he followed Thomas around with a dog-like devotion that Thomas bore with the patient gravity of a 7-year-old who takes his responsibilities seriously. That October, New Mexico was still a territory, but the conversations about statehood were intensifying, and there was a real sense among the people who lived there that things were changing in ways that were both promising and uncertain. Elvira and Isaiah talked about it on the porch in the evenings, about what statehood would mean for the land claims and the legal standing of the various communities in the territory, about what kind of state New Mexico ought to be and what kind of representatives it ought to send to Washington, conversations that went long into the night and that she found as interesting as any she had ever had. "You should run for something," Isaiah said to her once, only half joking. "I am not sure the territory is ready for that," she said. "The territory was not ready for a woman on the town council either," he said, "and here we are." She looked at him sidelong. "You would be all right with that?" She asked, "If I ran for something?" "Elvira," he said, with a patience that contained within it a complete and long-standing certainty, "I fell in love with you while you were standing up in front of a room that wanted you to sit down and be quiet, speaking the truth regardless. What would make you think I would want you to sit down and be quiet about anything else?" She looked at him for a long moment with the full depth of what she felt for him present in her face, which she had learned over the years to simply let be there rather than guarding it. "I love you," she said. "I want you to know that I am aware of exactly what that is, and I do not take it for granted for a single day." "I know you don't," he said. "Neither do I." He reached across and took her hand, the same gesture he had made on the porch in the rainstorm in October of 1882, the same warmth and steadiness in it, and she held his hand and looked out at the land around her, the land that was hers, that was theirs, that they had held and kept and made something of together. And she felt, as she had felt more days than not for 7 years, the deep and settled contentment of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be. The Dusty Spur Saloon was still operating in Red Rock Flats in 1889, somewhat tidier than it had been in 1882 and considerably more democratic in its atmosphere, the oil lamps burning with the same amber warmth. If you had gone in on a quiet Wednesday evening, you might have seen, at a table in the back, a tall, lean man with gray beginning at his temples, watching the room with steady, dark eyes, a cup of coffee untouched on the table before him, the same posture and the same quality of patient attention with which he had always occupied any room he was in. And if someone had stood up at the front of that room and said something true that nobody wanted to hear, he would have said, in the same unhurried, carrying voice that had first cut through the noise in the autumn of 1882, that he believed them. He always had. He always would. Outside, tied at the rail, two horses waited side by side in the cool night air. A reliable older mare and a lean dark gelding, patient and calm, the way of animals that have been well looked after for a long time and know it. The stars over New Mexico territory were what they had always been, spectacular and vast and indifferent, and the land stretched out under them in every direction, old and enduring and real, holding everything that had happened on it and everything that was still to come. Inside the Grady property, 3 children slept. The fence lines held. The herd was strong. The ledger on the study shelf was full, both handwritings running to the very last page and a new one waiting beside it, ready to be begun. And Elvira Grady Ford, who had stood up and said the true thing when it cost her, and Isaiah Ford, who had believed her when no one else would, had built from those 3 words a life that was full and honest and holy, entirely their own.